The First Man into Space. Cadet Marshall Farnsworth woke from a nightmare of exploding novae and fouling rockets. After recovering from his fright, he laughed contemptuously at himself. Here I was picked as the most stable of a group of 200 cadets, he thought, and chosen to make man's first trip into space. Yet I'm shaken like a leaf. He got out of bed and went over to the window. From his father's temporary apartment, he could see distant Sky Harbor, the scene of the plunge into space tomorrow night. He had been awarded the frightening honor of making that trip. As he watched teardrop cars whip along Phoenix, Arizona's double-deck streets, elevated over one another to avoid dangerous intersections and delaying stoplights, he thought back over the years to the 1950s, when mice and monkeys were sent up in Vikings to launch mankind's first probing of the mysterious space beyond Earth, and the first satellites were launched, to the 1960s, when huger multiple-stage rockets finally conquered the problem of escape velocity, to 1975, today, when man was finally ready to send one of his own kind into the uninhabited deeps. Marshall climbed back into bed, but sleep would not come. In the adjoining room, he could hear the footsteps of mother and father. By their sound, he knew they were the footsteps of worried people. This hurt Marsh more than his own uneasiness. The anxiety had begun for them, he knew, when he had first signed up for space cadet training. They had known there was an extremely high percentage of washouts, and after each test he passed, they had pretended to be glad. But Marsh knew that inwardly they had hoped he would fail, for they were aware of the ultimate goal that the space scientists were working for, the goal that had just now been reached. Marsh finally fell into a troubled sleep that lasted until morning. He woke early before the alarm rang. He got up, showered, pulled on his blue-corded cadet uniform, and tugged on the polished gray boots. He took one final look around his room as though in farewell, then went out to the kitchen. His folks were up ahead of time, too, trying to act as though it were just another day. Dad was pretending to enjoy his morning paper, nodding only casually to Marsh when he came in. Mom was stirring scrambled eggs in the skillet, but she wasn't a very good actor, Marsh noticed, for she furtively wiped her eyes with her free hand. The eggs were cooked too hard, and the toast had to be scraped, but no one seemed to care. The three of them sat down at the table, still speaking in monosyllables and of unimportant things. They made a pretense of eating. "Well, Mom," Dad suddenly said with a forced jollity that was intended to break the tension, "the Farnsworth family has finally got a celebrity in it." "I don't see why they don't send an older man," Mom burst out, as though she had been holding it in as long as she could. "Sending a boy who isn't even 22. "Things are different nowadays, Mom," Dad explained, still with the assumed calmness that masked his real feelings. "These days men grow up faster and mature quicker. They're stronger and more alert than older men." His voice trailed off, as if he were unable to convince himself. "Somebody has to go," Marsh said. Why not a younger man without family and responsibility? That's why they're giving younger men more opportunities today than they used to. It's not younger men I'm talking about, Mom blurted out. It's you, Marsh. Dad leaned over and patted Mom on the shoulder. Now, Ruth, we promised not to get excited this morning. I'm sorry, Mom said weakly, but Marsh is too young to. She caught herself and put her hand over her mouth. Stop talking like that, Dad said. Marsh is coming back. There have been thousands of rockets sent aloft. The space engineers have made sure that every bug has been ironed out before risking a man's life. Why, that rocket which Marsh is going up in is as safe as our auto in the garage, isn't it, Marsh? I hope so, Dad, Marsh murmured. Later, as Dad drove Marsh to the field, each brooded silently. Every scene along the way seemed to take on a new look for Marsh. He saw things that he had never noticed before. It was an uncomfortable feeling, almost as if he were seeing these things for the last as well as the first time. Finally, the airport came into view. The guards at the gate recognized Marsh and ushered the Farnsworth car through ahead of scores of others that crowded the entrance. Some eager news photographers slipped up close and shot off flashbulbs in Marsh's eyes. Sky Harbor, once a small commercial field, had been taken over by the Air Force in recent years and converted into the largest rocket experimental center in the United States. Dad drove up to the building that would be the scene of Marsh's first exhaustive tests and briefings. He stopped the car, and Marsh jumped out. Their goodbye was brief. Marsh saw his father's mouth quiver. There was a tightness in his own throat. He had gone through any number of grueling tests to prove that he could take the rigors of space, but not one of them had prepared him for the hardest moments of parting. When Dad had driven off, Marsh reported first to the psychiatrist who checked his condition. Pulse fast, a rise in blood pressure, he said. You're excited, aren't you, son? Yes, sir, Marsh admitted. Maybe they've got the wrong man, sir. I might fail them. The doctor grinned. They don't have the wrong man, he said. They might have, with a so-called iron-nerved fellow. He could contain his tension and fears until later, until maybe the moment of blast-off. Then he'd let go, and when he needed his calmest judgment, he wouldn't have it. No, Marshall, there isn't a man alive who could make this history-making flight without some anxiety. Forget it. You'll feel better as the day goes on. I'll see you once more before the blast-off. Marsh felt more at ease already. He went on to the space surgeon and was given a complete physical examination and was pronounced in perfect condition. Then he began his review briefing on everything he would encounter during the flight. Blast-off time was for 22:30, an hour and a half before midnight. Since at night, in the Western Hemisphere, Earth was masking the sun, the complications of excessive temperatures in the outer reaches were avoided during the time Marsh would be outside the ship. Marsh would occupy the small upper third section of a 3-stage rocket. The first two parts would be jettisoned after reaching their peak velocities. Top speed of the third stage would carry Marsh into a perpetual flight orbit around Earth, along the route that a permanent space station was to be built after the results of the flight were studied. After spending a little while in this orbit, Marsh would begin the precarious journey back to Earth in gliding flight. He got a few hours of sleep after sunset. When an officer shook him, he rose from the cot he had been lying on in a private room of General Forsyth, Chief of Space Operations. "It's almost time, son," the officer said. "Your CO wants to see you in the outside office." Marsh went into the adjoining room and found his cadet chief awaiting him. The youth detected an unusual warmth about the severe gentleman who previously had shown only a firm, uncompromising attitude. Colonel Tregasker was past middle age, and his white, sparse hair was smoothed down close to his head in regulation neatness. "Well, this is it, Marshal," the colonel said. "How I envy you the honor of being the first human to enter space. However, I do feel that a part of me is going along too, since I had a small share in preparing you for the trip. If the training was harsh at times, I believe that shortly you will understand the reason for it." "I didn't feel that the colonel was either too soft or strict, sir," Marsh said diplomatically. A speaker out on the brilliantly lit field blared loudly in the cool desert night. "X minus 40 minutes. "We can't talk right now, Marshal," the colonel said briskly. "You've got a job to do. But first, a few of your friends want to wish you luck." He called into the anteroom. "You may come in, gentlemen." There filed smartly into the room 10 youths who had survived the hard pre-space course with Marsh and would be his successors in case he failed tonight. They formed a line and shook hands with Marsh. The first was Airman Norton, who had gotten sick in the rugged centrifuge at a force of 9 Gs, then had rallied to pass the test. "Good luck, Marsh," he said. Next was lanky Lawrence Egan, who had been certain he would wash out during navigation phase in the planetarium. "All the luck in the world, Marsh," he added. Each cadet brought back a special memory of his training as they passed before him, wishing him success. When they had gone and the speaker outside had announced, "X minus 30 minutes," the colonel said that he and Marsh had better be leaving. Colonel Tregasker was to be Marsh's escort to the ship. Photographers and newspapermen swarmed about them as they climbed into the jeep that was to take them to the launching site further out on the field. Questions were flung at the two from all sides, but the colonel deftly maneuvered the jeep through the mob and sped off over the asphalt. At the blast-off site, Marsh could see the police had their hands full, keeping out thousands of spectators who were trying to get into the closed-off area. The field was choked with a tide of humanity milling about in wild confusion. Giant searchlights, both at the airport and in other parts of Phoenix, directed spears of light on the towering rocket that held the interest of all the world tonight. There was one light, far larger than the rest, with powerful condensing lenses and connected to a giant radar screen, which would guide Marsh home from his trip among the stars. A high wire fence surrounded the launching ramp and blockhouses. International scientists and dignitaries with priorities formed a ring around the fence, but even they were not allowed inside the small circle of important activity. The guards waved the colonel and Marsh through the gate. Marsh had spent many weeks in a mock-up of the tiny third stage in which he was to spend his time aloft, but he had never been close to the completely assembled ship until this moment. The 3 stages had been nicknamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. Marsh swallowed as his eyes roved up the side of the great vessel, part of a project that had cost millions to perfect and was as high as a 4-story building. The gigantic base, Big Tom, was the section that would have the hardest job to do, that of thrusting the rocket through the densest part of the atmosphere, and this was a great deal larger than the other section. Marsh knew that most of the ship's bulk was made up of the propellant fuel of hydrazine hydrate and its oxidizer, nitric acid. "We're going into that blockhouse over there," Colonel Tregasker said. "You'll don your space gear in there." First, a multitude of gadgets with wires were fastened to the cadet's wrists, ankles, nose, and head. Marsh knew this to be one of the most important phases of the flight, to find out a man's reaction to space flight under actual rocketing conditions. Each wire would telemeter certain information by radio back to the airport. After a tight inner G-suit had been put on to prevent blackout, the plastic and rubber outer garment was zipped up around Marsh, and then he was ready, except for his helmet, which would not be donned until later. Marsh and the colonel went back outside. The open-cage elevator was lowered from the top of the big lattice platform that surrounded the rocket. The 2 got into the cage, and it rose with them. Marsh had lost most of his anxiety and tension during the activities of the day, but his knees felt rubbery in these final moments as the elevator carried him high above the noisy confusion of the airport. This was it. As they stepped from the cage onto the platform of the 3rd stage, Marsh heard the speaker below call out, "X minus 20 minutes." There were 11 engineers and workmen on the platform, readying the compartment that Marsh would occupy. Marsh suddenly felt helpless and alone as he faced the small chamber that might very well be his death cell. Its intricate dials and wires were staggering in their complexity. Marsh turned and shook hands with Colonel Tregasker. "Goodbye, sir," he said in a quavering voice. "I hope I remember everything the Corps taught me." He tried to smile, but his facial muscles twitched uncontrollably. "Good luck, son. Lots of it," the officer said huskily. Suddenly, he leaned forward and embraced the youth with a firm, fatherly hug. "This is not regulations," he mumbled gruffly, "but hang regulations." He turned quickly and asked to be carried down to the ground. A man brought Marsh's helmet and placed it over his head, then clamped it to the suit. Knobs on the suit were twisted, and Marsh felt a warm, pressurized helium-oxygen mixture fill his suit and headpiece. Marsh stepped through the hatch into the small compartment. He reclined on the soft contoured chair, and the straps were fastened by one of the engineers over his chest, waist, and legs. The wires connected to various parts of his body had been brought together into a single unit in the helmet. The wire cable leading from the panel was plugged into the outside of the helmet, to complete the circuit. Final tests were run off to make sure everything was in proper working order, including the two-way shortwave radio that would have to penetrate the electrical ocean of the ionosphere. Then the double-hatch airlock was closed. Through his helmet receiver, Marsh could hear the final minutes and seconds being called off from inside the blockhouse. "Everything okay?" Marsh was asked by someone on the platform. "Yes, sir," Marsh replied. "Then you're on your own," were the final ominous words. "X minus 5 minutes," called the speaker. It was the longest 5 minutes that Marsh could remember. He was painfully aware of his cramped quarters. He thought of the tons of explosive beneath him that presently would literally blow him sky high. And he thought of the millions of people the world over who at this moment were hovering at radios and TVs, anxiously awaiting the dawn of the space age. Finally, he thought of Dad and Mom, lost in that multitude of night watchers, and among the few who were not primarily concerned with the scientific aspect of the experiment. He wondered if he would ever see them again. X minus 60 seconds. Marsh knew that a warning flare was being sent up, to be followed by a whistle and a cloud of smoke from one of the blockhouses. As he felt fear trying to master him, he began reviewing all the things he must remember and, above all, what to do in an emergency. X minus 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire! There was a mighty explosion at Sky Harbor. The initial jolt which Marshall felt was much fiercer than the gradually built-up speed of the whirling centrifuge in training. He was crushed deeply into his contoured chair. He felt as though someone were pressing on his eyeballs. Indeed, as if every organ in his body were clinging to his backbone. But these first moments would be the worst. A gauge showed a force of 7 Gs on him, equal to half a ton. He watched the Mach numbers rise on the dial in front of his eyes on an overhead panel. Each Mach number represented that much times the speed of sound, 1,090 feet per second, 740 miles an hour. Marsh knew Big Tom would blast for about a minute and a half under control of the automatic pilot, at which time it would drop free at an altitude of 25 miles and sink earthward in a metal mesh chute. Marsh's hurting eyes flicked to the outside temperature gauge. It was on a steady 67 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and would be until he reached 20 miles. A reflecting prism gave him a square of view of the sky outside. The clear, deep blue of the cloud-free stratosphere met his eyes. Mach 5, Mach 6, Mach 7 passed very quickly. He heard a rumble and felt a jerk. Big Tom was breaking free. The first hurdle had been successfully overcome, and the ship had already begun tilting into its trajectory. There was a new surge of agony on his body as the second stage picked up the acceleration at a force of 7 Gs again. Marsh clamped his jaws as the force pulled his lips back from his teeth and dragged his cheek muscles down. The Mach numbers continued to rise, 11, 12, 13, to altitude 200 miles, the outer fringe of the Earth's atmosphere. There was a slight lifting of the pressure on his body. The rocket was still in the stratosphere, but the sky was getting purple. Mach 14, 10,000 miles an hour. Dick would jettison at any moment. Marsh had been aloft only about 4 minutes, but it had seemed an age, every tortured second of it. There was another rumble as the second stage broke free. Marsh felt a new surge directly beneath him as his own occupied section, Harry, began blasting. It was comforting to realize he had successfully weathered those tons of exploding hydrazine and acid that could have reduced him to nothing if something had gone wrong. Although his speed was still building up, the weight on him began to ease steadily as his body's inertia finally yielded to the sickeningly swift acceleration. The speedometer needle climbed to Mach 21, the peak velocity of the rocket, 16,000 miles per hour. His altitude was 350 miles, man's highest ascent. Slowly, then, the speedometer began to drop back. Marsh heard the turbo pumps and jets go silent as the lift fuel was spent and Rocket Harry began its free flight orbit around Earth. The ship had reached a speed which exactly counterbalanced the pull of gravity, and it could, theoretically, travel this way forever, provided no other outside force acted upon it. The effect on Marsh now was as if he had stopped moving. Relieved of the vice-like pressure, his stomach and chest for a few seconds felt like inflated balloons. Cadet Farnsworth, the voice of General Forsyth, spoke into his helmet receiver. "Are you all right?" "Yes, sir," Marsh replied. "That is, I think so." It was good to hear a human voice again, something to hold on to in this crazy, unreal world into which he had been hurtled. "We're getting the electronic readings from your gauges okay," the voice went on. "The doctor says your pulse is satisfactory under the circumstances." It was queer having your pulse read from 350 miles up in the air. Marsh realized, of course, that he was not truly in the air. A glance at his air pressure gauge confirmed this. He was virtually in a vacuum. The temperature and wind velocity outside might have astounded him if he were not prepared for the readings. The heat was over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind velocity was of hurricane force. But these figures meant nothing because of the sparseness of air molecules. Temperature and wind applied only to the individual particles, which were thousands of feet apart. "How is your cosmic ray count?" asked the general. Marsh checked the C-ray counter on the panel from which clicking sounds were coming. "It's low, sir. Nothing to worry about." Cosmic rays, the most powerful emanations known, were the only radiation in space that could not be protected against, but in small doses they had found not to be dangerous. "As soon as our recorders get more of the figures your telemeter is giving us," the operations chief said, "you can leave the rocket." When Marsh got the okay a few minutes later, he eagerly unstrapped the belts around his body. He could hardly contain his excitement at being the first person to view the globe of Earth from space. As he struggled to his feet, the lightness of zero gravity made him momentarily giddy, and it took some minutes for him to adjust to the terribly strange sensation. He had disconnected the cable leading from his helmet to the ship's transmitter and switched on the ship's fast-lens movie camera that would photograph the area covered by Harry. Then he was ready to go outside. He pressed a button on the wall, and the first airlock hatch opened. He floated into the narrow alcove and closed the door in the cramped chamber behind him. He watched a gauge, and when it showed normal pressure and temperature again, he opened the outside hatch, closing it behind him. Had Marsh permitted the vacuum of space to contact the interior of the ship's quarters, delicate instruments would have been ruined by the sudden decompression and loss of heat. Marsh fastened his safety line to the ship so that there was no chance of his becoming separated from it. Then he looked downward to experience the thrill of his life. Like a gigantic relief map, the panorama of Earth stretched across his vision. A downy blanket of gray atmosphere spread over the whole of it, and patches of clouds were seen floating like phantom shapes beneath the clear vastness of the stratosphere. It was a stunning sight for Marsh, seeing the pinpoint lights of the night cities extending from horizon to horizon. It gave him an exhilarating feeling of being a king over it all. Earth appeared to be rotating, but Marsh knew it was largely his own and the rocket's fast speed that was responsible for the illusion. As he hung in this region of the exosphere, he was thankful for his cadet training in zero gravity. A special machine, developed only in recent years, simulated the weightlessness of space and trained the cadets for endurance in such artificial conditions. "Describe some of the things you see, Marshal," General Forsyth said over Marsh's helmet receiver. "I've just cut in a recorder." "It's a scene almost beyond description, sir," Marsh said into the helmet mic. "The sky is thickly powdered with stars. The Milky Way is very distinct, and I can make out lots of fuzzy spots that must be star clusters and nebulae and comets. Mars is like an extremely bright tail light, and the moon is so strong it hurts my eyes as much as the direct sun does on Earth." Marsh saw a faintly luminous blur pass beyond the ship. It had been almost too sudden to catch. He believed it to be a meteor diving earthward at a speed around 45 miles a second. He reported this to the general. As he brought his eyes down from the more distant fixtures of space to those closer by on Earth, a strange thing happened. He was suddenly seized with a fear of falling, although his zero-gravity training had been intended to prepare him against this very thing. A cold sweat came out over his body, and uncontrollable panic threatened to take hold of him. He made a sudden movement as though to catch himself. Forgetting the magnification of motion in frictionless space and his own weightlessness, he was shot quickly to the end of his safety line and cracked like a whip. His body jerked at the taut end and then sped swiftly back in reaction toward the ship, head foremost. A collision could crack his helmet, exposing his body to decompression, causing him to swell like a balloon and finally explode. In the grip of numbing fear, only at the last moment did he have the presence of mind to flip his body in a half cartwheel and bring his boots up in front of him for protection. His feet bumped against the rocket's side, and the motion sent him hurtling back out to the end of the safety line again. This back-and-forth action occurred several times before he could stop completely. "I've got to be careful," he panted to himself as he thought of how close his space career had come to being ended scarcely before it had begun. General Forsyth cut in with great concern, wondering what had happened. When Marsh had explained, and the general seemed satisfied that Marsh had recovered himself, he had Marsh go on with his description. His senseless fear having gone now, Marsh looked down calmly, entranced as the features of the United States passed below his gaze. He named the cities he could identify, also the mountain ranges, lakes, and rivers, explaining just how they looked from 350 miles up. In only a fraction of an hour's time, the rocket had traversed the entire country and was approaching the twinkling phosphorescence of the Atlantic. Marsh asked if Tom and Dick had landed safely. "Tom landed near Roswell, New Mexico," General Forsyth told him, "and the chute of the second section has been reported seen north of Dallas. I think you'd better start back now, Marshal. It'll take us many months to analyze all the information we've gotten. We can't contact you very well on the other side of the world either, and thirdly, I don't want you exposed to the sun's rays outside the atmosphere in the eastern hemisphere any longer than can be helped." Marsh tugged carefully on his safety line and floated slowly back towards the ship. He entered the airlock, then, inside, he raised the angle of his contour chair to upright position, facing the console of the ship's manual controls for the glide earthward. He plugged in his telemeter helmet cable and buckled one of the straps across his waist. Since he was still moving at many thousands of miles an hour, it would be suicide to plunge straight downward. He and the glider would be turned into a meteoric torch. Rather, he would have to spend considerable time soaring in and out of the atmosphere in braking ellipses until he reached much lower speed. Then the Earth's gravitational pull would do the rest. This was going to be the trickiest part of the operation and the most dangerous. Where before Marsh had depended on automatic controls to guide him, now much of the responsibility was on his own judgment. He remembered the many hours he had sweated through to log his flying time. Now he could look back on that period in his training and thank his lucky stars for it. He took the manual controls and angled into the atmosphere. He carefully watched the AHF dial, the atmospheric heat friction gauge. When he had neared the dangerous incendiary point, with the ship having literally become red hot, he soared into the frictionless vacuum again. He had to keep this up a long time in order to reduce his devastating speed. It was something of a shock to him to leave the black midnight of Earth's slumbering side for the brilliant hemisphere where the people of Europe and Asia were going about their daytime tasks. He would have liked to study this other half of the world, which he had glimpsed only a few times before in his supersonic test flights. But he knew this would have to wait for future flights. Finally, after a long time, his velocity was slowed enough so that the tug of gravity was stronger than the rocket's ability to pull up out of the atmosphere. At this point, Marsh cut in Harry's forward braking jets to check his falling speed. "There's something else to worry about," he thought to himself. Will old Harry hold together, or will he fly apart in the crushing atmosphere? The directional radio signals from the powerful Sky Harbor transmitter were growing stronger as Marsh neared the shores of California. He could see the winking lights of San Diego and Los Angeles, and farther inland, the swinging thread that was the beacon at Sky Harbor. All planes in his path of flight had been grounded for the past few hours because of the space flight. The only ground light scanning the skies was the gigantic space beacon in Phoenix. When Marsh reached Arizona, he began spiraling downward over the state to kill the rest of his altitude and airspeed. Even now, the plane was a hurtling supersonic metal sliver streaking through the night skies like a comet. He topped the snow-capped summits of the towering San Francisco peaks on the drive southward, and he recognized the sprawling serpent of the Grand Canyon. Then he was in the lower desert regions of moon-splashed sand and cactus. Although the fire-hot temperature of the outer skin had subsided, there had been damage done to the walls and instruments, and possibly to other parts too. Marsh was worried lest his outside controls might be too warped to give him a good touchdown, if indeed he could get down safely at all. A few thousand feet up, Marsh lowered his landing gear. Now the only problem left was to land himself and the valuable ship safely inside the narrow parallels of the airstrip. He circled the airport several times as his altitude continued to plummet. The meter fell rapidly. His braking rocket fuel was gone now. From here on in, he would be on gliding power alone. "Easy does it, Marshal," the general said quietly into his ear. "You're lining up fine. Level it out a little and keep straight with the approach lights. That's fine. You're just about in." The lights of the airport seeming to rush up at him, Marshall felt a jolt as the wheels touched ground on the west end of the runway. He kept the ship steady as it scurried along the smooth asphalt, losing the last of its once tremendous velocity. The plane hit the restraining wire across the strip and came to a sudden stop, shoving Marsh hard against the single safety belt he wore. Finally, incredibly, the ship was still and he was safe. He unfastened his strap and removed his space helmet. The heat of the compartment brought the sweat out on his face. He rose on wobbly legs and pressed the buttons to the hatches. The last door flew open to admit the cool, bracing air of Earth, which he had wondered if he would ever inhale again. His aloneness was over then, suddenly and boisterously, as men swarmed over him with congratulations, eager questions, and looks of respect. Reporters' flashbulbs popped, and he felt like a new Limburg as he was pulled down to the ground and mobbed. Finally, the police came to his rescue and pushed back the curiosity seekers and newspaper men. Then only 3 men were allowed through the cordon. The first to reach him was General Forsyth, who almost seemed to have ridden with him the whole way. He grabbed Marsh's hand and clapped him on the shoulder. He said briefly, "You've launched the age of space travel, Marshal. Congratulations, son. Now go home with your father and get a good night's rest. We'll see you tomorrow." "Thank you, sir," Marsh replied. Colonel Tregasker came forward, and there was moisture visible in the eyes of the cadet officer. "Now that one of my boys has made the first trip into space and fulfilled a career-long dream, I can retire in peace, he murmured. I'm proud to have been associated with you, Marshal Farnsworth. Congratulations, my boy. Then Dad had his turn. He stood for a moment in front of his son as though undecided what to do, hat in hand, the night breeze ruffling his hair. Mr. Farnsworth seemed embarrassed by the grandeur of the moment and reluctant to accept a part in one of the greatest accomplishments of modern times. Marsh moved forward and clasped his shoulders. I did it, Dad, he said. Thank God for bringing you back safely, his father murmured huskily. Are you ready to go home, son? Suddenly, March was terribly weary, and he felt as if he could sleep for days. I am kind of tired, he said. Let's go home and see Mom. The people around seemed to realize that this was not their moment. They parted ranks quietly as the father and his son walked through them and got into their car. As they drove off, even the stars and planets seemed to be standing silent and watchful in respect for the dawn of space travel on the tiny pebble that was Earth. End of section 1.